What should you buy, a new build or an old build property here in Germany? Hey there, and welcome back to Hypofriend, your favorite channel dedicated to helping you find and get the right mortgage options. My name is Luca, I'm a mortgage expert, and today we're going to talk about whether you should buy a Neubau or an Altbau property in Germany. So let's get right into it. Before I start breaking down the pros and cons, I want to first step back and take a second to clarify that when I say Neubau, I'm not referring to building your own house on a plot of land that you've identified, but rather buying an existing project that is currently under development by a developer or Bauträger. First, let's talk about the benefits of buying a new build property. The first is that typically new build properties are sold with no agency fee. This means that the mandatory purchase fees, which include the property transfer tax, notary fee, and if applicable real estate commission, are going to be reduced. Therefore, if your savings are currently limiting you from being able to afford the property of your dreams, then finding a new build property is one way to reduce the initial costs so that your savings are no longer a constraint. The second benefit of buying a new build property is that you have lower maintenance costs. This doesn't have to only do with energy efficiency. Obviously, a lot of new build properties are more energy efficient, which is going to save you money in the long term, but also maintenance costs for new build properties tend to be much smaller. For example, Altbau properties every single year, on average, have around 1% of the property price in maintenance, whereas new build properties on average have 0.5%. Another advantage to consider if you're buying a new build property is that typically they have higher rental prices per square meter. This might interest you specifically if you're buying the property for investment purposes and you are looking to rent it out in the future. But even if you're buying the property for own use, keep in mind that when you buy a property, you're probably going to own it for like 5, 10, 15 years. A lot can happen in that time. So having a property that will allow you to easily rent it out and hopefully almost cover your monthly rate or maybe even give you a small profit is definitely an advantage. A good example of this is just not so long ago in Berlin, there were discussions about introducing a price ceiling, a rental price ceiling, I should say. The way this rental price ceiling was designed was that based on the construction year of your property, you would be able to charge a certain amount of rent to your tenants. New build properties had a major advantage in that case. Now, luckily, this wasn't implemented in Berlin. However, things like this can happen in the future. So having a new build property puts you in a position where you can rely on the property for a long-term rental stream of income. The next advantage of buying a new build property are the customization options at your disposal. Every single developer is going to give you what we call a Sonderwünsche. So basically a list of equipment that you can choose to install into your apartment before it's prepared. Now, before you run and immediately go ahead and buy a new build property, hold your horses. Like with everything, there are pros and cons. So let's talk about those cons a little bit. The first disadvantage that I would like to mention is the fact that usually new build properties come at a much higher price. Now, this wouldn't be an issue if you could just negotiate the price down. But unfortunately, with new build properties, you can't. What they're going to tell you is that the cost of the construction is factored into the price, and for that reason, you can't negotiate. And it's true. For new build properties, typically you can. The reason I bring this up is because in 2023, interest rates have increased so much that it's now a buyer's market. And negotiating the property price down is essential to taking advantage of this current market. Another one of the biggest problems of buying a new build property that we have to address is the construction time. When you buy a new build, usually it's going to take at least 6 months to 1 year and sometimes up to 2.5 years for the property to be constructed. One question that you might ask is, well, when do I have to pay for everything? That's the thing. You have to pay for everything in the beginning. When you're applying for the mortgage, initially, you have to show the bank the equity that you plan to use towards your purchase. In other words, if you don't have that equity at that time, then getting the mortgage is going to be really difficult with good conditions. And as soon as you pay everything in the very beginning, the construction period starts, which means that you're going to have to continue paying rent for at least a year to a year and a half to 2 years, depending on when your property is going to be finished. This leads me to the next disadvantage. You're probably wondering, during this construction period, am I expected to pay the full mortgage payment and my rent simultaneously? Well, the answer is yes and no. In German, we would say, Jein. When you buy a new build property, you indeed have this 12-month period or maybe 2-year period when the property is under construction. Now, during this period, the banks are going to give you something called a Bereitstellungszinsfreie Zeit. But what this means in English is commitment fee-free period. In other words, a period of time during which you don't have to pay the full mortgage payment. That doesn't mean, however, that you don't have to pay anything at all. The way it works is that every developer has an installment plan according to which the bank is going to pay them the full property price in several installments. Imagine you're buying a 100,000 euro property. Imagine that the developer of this property has an installment plan with 10 installments equal to 10,000 euros. In other words, the bank is going to pay the developer 10,000 euros 10 times to equal to 100,000 euros. When the bank pays the first 10,000, you're going to have to pay your interest rate multiplied by 10,000 divided by 12. Then the bank pays the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. And you keep paying the interest multiplied by the total amount that has been paid to the developer divided by 12. So keep in mind that when you're buying a new build property, you are going to have higher running costs. Your rent combined with partial interest payments that you'll have to give the bank during the construction period. Okay, Altbau time. So let's shift our focus on the pros and the cons of buying an Altbau property. Let me start with the pros. First and foremost, the price. Not only do Altbau properties tend to have much lower prices than new builds, but also you can negotiate the price. As you might remember from our previous section, it's impossible to negotiate the price of new build properties, usually. One of the benefits of buying an Altbau property, therefore, is the fact that you can negotiate very aggressively. Today in 2023, in this buyer's market, you can typically negotiate the price down from 5 to 10%. Matter of fact, we made a video on negotiating the property price. I think you might be able to find it right there. Now, the next benefit of buying an Altbau property is that they often are situated in very convenient and prime locations. Unlike Neubau properties that usually need to be constructed somewhere where there's not a lot of infrastructure, Altbau properties have usually been there for quite a while. So if you're looking to buy something central, chances are that it's going to be much easier for you to do that if you're looking for an Altbau property. Let's be honest here. Everybody likes high ceilings and thick walls. Altbau properties usually come with certain historic features and elements that simply can't be found with new builds. But it goes beyond that. Typically, new build properties try to cram as many apartments inside the building as possible. This is disadvantageous not only because you're constantly aware of the fact that there's like 300 people listening to you, but also because a lot of banks use the number of units in the building as one of the contributing factors that determine the value of the property in the eyes of the bank. In other words, it may be easier for you to get financing on an older property, not only because of the price point, but also because of the valuation methods that are used by the bank. This next section is for the investor who already stopped watching the video because he decided he's going to buy a new build property. See, some Altbaus are what we consider hidden gems. We talked about the rental price per square meter being higher for new build properties. However, let's say you found a property that was built 100 years ago, but that property has undergone what we call in Germany a Kernsanierung, in other words, a full renovation. In that case, despite the fact that the property has been constructed a while back, you can still charge rental prices per square meter for it similar to those for new build properties. In other words, you get the best of both worlds. You get the ability to negotiate because it's an Altbau, and you get the higher rental price per square meter because the apartment has been fully renovated and the building itself is in prime condition. As always, we can't only mention the pros, we also have to mention the cons. So let's take a second and talk about the downsides of buying Altbau property. The first, which I already mentioned in the first segment, is maintenance costs. On average, people spend around 1% of the property price per year on maintaining an Altbau property. Of course, energy efficiency is another important consideration. Typically, Altbau properties are not really energy efficient, and this is becoming a growing issue. For example, by law, properties with an energy class of F, G, and H are going to have to be modernized by 2030. So if you don't do your research and you jump into a property without looking at it in depth, what might happen to you is that you encounter these unexpected costs, which are very hefty. Now, on a related note, it's not only important that the property itself, the apartment itself has been modernized and maintained in the last few years, but also the building. Every homeowners association has a predetermined budget that is allocated towards maintaining and fixing the building in case of unexpected costs. But often this budget isn't big enough. If it isn't, then remaining costs is divided and split amongst all owners of that building. So make sure that not only the apartment has undergone sufficient modernization and maintenance in the last few years, but the building itself as well. Let's talk a little bit about renovation challenges. The bank uses the property as collateral, and if the property is run down and broken, well, they might not want to sponsor your modernization plans. Getting financing on these properties is usually really difficult. If you're trying to renovate a property as well, keep in mind that from the mortgage perspective, before you can apply for a loan, you're going to have to speak to a construction company who's going to give you a Kostenaufstellung, in other words, a cost quote that you show to the bank and get these costs approved. The bank is not going to pay for all of your renovation and modernization costs. As a matter of fact, they're going to differentiate between renovation and modernization. Renovation are small things like painting the walls, like flooring, whereas modernizations are things like building a wall, breaking a wall, adding pipes, electricity, the bathroom, and windows, for instance. Be careful before you start planning your renovation, because not all of these costs are going to be covered by the bank. So speak to an expert and do your research. Another important thing is that some renovations can't happen at all. If the property has what we call Denkmalschutz, then it's protected by the government and you may not be able to make certain changes that you want to. Now finally, let's talk about the last disadvantage of buying an Altbau property. Typically, 85% of all Altbau properties are sold by a real estate agent. The fact of the matter is that most of the time you will have to pay an agency fee. So keep that in mind. Your initial costs, which I listed earlier, are going to be higher, and if you don't have enough savings to cover those initial costs, you're either going to have to get an expensive private loan, or you won't be able to qualify for the mortgage at all. So at the end of the day, what should you buy? Well, personally, when possible, I would try to opt for the best of both worlds. Either a property that has been constructed in the last 5 to 10 years, or a really old build that has been fully renovated in the last 5 to 10 years. Because that way, you could enjoy the price point and the negotiation that comes with having an Altbau property, while having lower running costs and more energy efficiency like a new build property. Of course, it's your purchase. They're your plans. You have to do your research and make sure that you find a property that best fits for you. So I'm glad we could help you a little bit. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and we hope to see you next time.